So today's webinar will focus on improving the use of research evidence in ways that benefit youth. And I'll share some insights into what we look for and how we evaluate applications. So first, I want to appreciate all the questions that you submitted when you registered. And we hope that you'll find answers to many of those as we are going through the two sections. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and the slides from today's presentation, the whole recording will be posted in about a week, let's say 10 days on our website. So you can go back and revisit portions of the presentation that you'd like. And we also want to encourage you all to be more interactive. So this webinar is an opportunity for you to interface with the program staff. So please pose your questions through the question inbox within GoToWebinar. And we've created, as you'll see, at the end of part one, an opportunity for a Q&A, and then at the very end, we'll reserve space to answer your questions. An additional reminder is you can listen through the computer or the phone. Either way will work. If phone works better for you, you just click on the telephone button on the webinar. That will mute the audio coming from your computer. So as you see, the roadmap for the presentation, we've divided it into two parts. One is to provide an introduction to our foundation, what we fund, what our improving use of research evidence portfolio is, and I'll share some examples of grants we funded more recently. And in the second part, we'll dive into more of the specifics of the application process, right? How do you write a very compelling application that's competitive and gets you funded? So as an introduction, the William T. Grant Foundation, that was founded in 1936, is a private grant-making foundation that was started by William T. Grant himself, who was an owner of 5 and dime stores. The foundation has worked to further understanding of human behavior through research. And we do that by supporting high-quality research that is relevant to the policies and practices that affect the lives of young people between the ages of 5 to 25 within the United States. And we fund about $8.5 million a year in major research grants and about $15 million across all our grant programs. So as you'll see, the foundation awards research grants based on 2 focus areas. First one is reducing inequality. That's led by a program officer, a senior program officer, Dr. Jenny Irons, and that was launched in 2014, and its defining feature is a focus on responses to reducing inequality among young people in the United States, not understanding the cause of consequences. And the second focus area is the focus of our webinar today is our initiative on improving the use of research evidence that aims to advance the conversation about research use. The defining feature of this area is a focus on strategies for using research evidence. We support studies that improve the use of research evidence and conditions that support it in ways that benefit youth. We want to learn how to better use what we know from research. So all the work that we're doing as scholars and publishing, how do we get that into the hands of decision makers to improve youth outcomes? And for both our focus areas, we seek research that builds strong theory and empirical evidence. Now, there are different ways and different mechanisms through which we fund research. There are major research grants, there are scholars awards, institutional challenge grants. But today, in this presentation, I will focus only on major research grants and officers' research grants. And I'll share a little bit about what are the differences and what our funded grants have looked like for both of those. So first, what is our motivation, right? Why study ways to improve the use of research evidence? That's because we assume that knowledge and tools that have been generated from years of research will improve decision-making. They'll improve policy, practice, and have an impact, a positive impact on youth outcomes, but we lack the evidence. We have this theory of change, but we don't have evidence or sufficient evidence to test the robustness of this theory. And sometimes when researchers are designing research agendas, they can miss the mark on decision makers' concerns, their questions, their ideas, their priorities about what they really need to inform their policymaking and practices. We also know a lot about the conditions that are associated with research use, but we lack the knowledge about how can we create those conditions and whether these conditions, across these different youth serving institutions and settings, are they the same? Do they, function differently? So what we learn from research and the tools produced through research are not used to their full potential. So our goal and our motivation is to really get good quality research evidence in the hands of decision makers. So here is what you need to know. The overarching idea, and the one thing that I would like for you to take away from this talk, is that we are interested in studying ways to improve research use. How do we get at that? Is through our 2 lines of inquiry. So we're prioritizing 2 ways of getting at that. One is studies that will build or identify test strategies to improve the use of existing research evidence. And this also includes co-producing, co-designing research evidence that the policymakers and practitioners can then use for their decision making. And studies that, the second line of inquiry is studies that will investigate under what conditions using this high quality research improves decision making and ultimately outcomes for research. So we are interested in research use involving policymakers, agency leaders, organizational managers, intermediaries, community organizers, and other decision makers that shape youth serving systems in the US. So decision makers who are not directly interacting with youth, so say administrators, community or organizational leaders. So for example, state and local departments of education, child welfare, juvenile justice, they make decisions that influence the frontline practices and they ultimately affect youth outcomes. Mid-level managers within agencies often decide which programs and tools to adopt and how to improve and allocate these resources. Intermediaries are of interest as they shape the production of research and translate and package it for use. And I also want to emphasize that we're also interested in leaders and decision makers at community organizations. So focus on decision makers across the board is welcome. So let's look at the first line of inquiry, right? So we're interested in systematic studies that identify, create, and test the structural and social conditions that foster routine and constructive uses of research. And we expect that these studies will build on prior work about the conditions that foster use. You'll find a lot of very helpful resources on our website. There's an essay by Dr. DuMont on our website that really lays out very beautifully the conditions for improving use of research. And the studies can really build on some aspects that might be relevant to the institution within which you're working or studying. So let's say existing studies, they provide important examples and empirical evidence about the processes, relationships, structures that are associated with the use of research evidence. In that case, investigators might draw on the work by the Foundation's grantees or explore the fields of knowledge translation and mobilization, which have a history of developing strategies to advance knowledge. For example, prior research suggests that opportunities for discussions about research and active deliberation, they foster value for research and deep understanding. So if we provide opportunities for formal, informal discussions and an opportunity for pushback and dialogue, these all seem critical, but we need to study them, right? So here are some examples that I wanted to share with you of the studies that we have funded under this line of inquiry a little more recently. So the first study, as you'll see here, is can the research to policy collaboration model be improved to reduce inequities for scholars of color in accessing policymakers, improving the timeliness of research and improving cost effectiveness. Now, what this study is doing is they're building on the team's previous work that demonstrated the efficacy of this model, the research to policy collaboration model, which was actually a very well constructed capacity building and collaboration between researchers and congressional offices that increased the use of research in child and family legislation. So they were asking, how can this model provide scholars of color with greater access to, engagement with, and influence on policymakers? And to do this, um, they are optimizing the model. So they are using interviews, they're using focus groups, design thinking to improve the existing platform before they conduct a randomized controlled trial, right? To compare the original model to this new enhanced version. So they're using a mixed methods design to get at that. They're doing the formative work and then testing it in more quantitative ways. So I won't go into great detail for each one of them in the interest of time, but I encourage you to review the grant descriptions on our website. So I'll go over the next few ones very briefly. We'll look at the overall aims of the approach. So as you will see, the Crowley study, the original research to policy collaboration model, it was at the federal level. The next study, the second bullet point here, this is a study by Yoakum and team, and it's assessing how staff in executive and legislative offices in 4 states make budget decisions. And based on that, they're creating a modeled budgeting toolkit to improve instrumental, conceptual, and symbolic use of research evidence in state budget cycles. And these words that I just used, they're just different ways that research use has been operationalized in the past. Again, more of that literature is available on our website. You'll be able to see conceptualizations and a lot of publications that have resulted from the work of our grantees. And they use a convergent mixed methods design and hypothetical choice experiments for the study. And the last example here, this is a study by Leah Frerichs and team, where they're going to develop and evaluate a decision analysis tool and guidance that supports opioid settlement funding decision makers' conceptual use of research evidence, so they can prioritize strategies that maximize impact on children and youth. And the sampling frame, it includes local agencies or public health departments or related social service agencies from all 100 counties and municipalities of North Carolina. So this was just to give you a mix of different levels at which these improving use of research studies have been conducted, right? From federal to state and more local level. We have some studies by Dr. Adam Settelbein at the county level, Elizabeth's Day. And like I said, you are able to access these on our website under awarded grants. Right at the top, there's a tab that will take you there, and you can select them by use of research evidence, by year, so really at a granular level. And the second line of inquiry, it's taking the theory forward, right? The theory of change, where the first goal is to improve the use of research evidence, but the second is to really take up the challenge of creating and testing conditions that lead to improved decision making, right? We really need to see the efforts that we're making to increase the take-up of research, engagement with research. Are they leading to improved decision making and ultimately better outcomes for youth? So we invite teams to investigate under what conditions using high quality research improves decision making and youth outcomes. We suspect that simply using research will not be sufficient to yield positive outcomes. Rather, the relationship between the use of research evidence and youth outcomes will be affected by a number of conditions. So as an example, I just wanted to share these 2 studies. The first one here is really examining the decision-making outcomes, and the second one is getting at the youth outcomes. So the first one here is a longitudinal case study design by Dr. Welsh and team, and it examines how an equity-centered research practice partnership may help decision makers address persistent racial inequities in school discipline by improving their use of research evidence. And I'll share a little more about this in our subsequent section. The second example here is by Dr. Chopida and team that examines the use of research evidence in clinical supervision activities and subsequent treatment sessions and the downstream implications of research use on youth outcomes. So what activities, supervisory activities, lead to mental health therapy practices that align with the use of evidence in mental health intervention context? And is there an effect of use of this research evidence in treatment on youth mental health outcomes? So this team is actually doing a secondary data analysis of a very large longitudinal data set. So, I just want to emphasize that for the last example that I shared, where they're really looking at improved use of research evidence in youth outcomes, they have undertaken the work to improve the use of research evidence in supervisory activities in a previous study. They're really building on that now to connect to the more distal outcomes in that in their theory of change. And I also wanted to take an opportunity to share 2 examples of our funded officers research grants. Now, these research grants are smaller in scope. They could be standalone projects, or they may build off larger projects. More specifics of these grants and the comparison to major grants is something I'll touch on, like I said, in the second section. But just sharing an example here so you can see how these research questions, these research objectives align with our lines of inquiry for improving the use of research evidence. So the first one is, how can collaboration between social science researchers and legal advocates be facilitated to improve the production and use of research evidence to defend educational rights of undocumented children? So in Plyler versus Doe, the Supreme Court rules that the Texas law aiming to exclude undocumented children from public school was unconstitutional. So given the recent threats advocating for a reversal of Plyler, Hopkins will use an embedded case study design to explore the experiences of social scientists and legal advocates as they seek to co-produce research evidence to defend the ruling. The participants are co-designing a research agenda and then reviewing and discussing results to refine future research endeavors that will be responsive to their larger goals. So it was of interest because examining how research co-design may improve social scientists' production of research is relevant to defending rights of youth in the US. And it is also improving the legal advocates' conceptual use of that research evidence. So when research evidence is shaping the way decision makers and advocates are thinking about a certain issue, that's the conceptual use. And the second example here is by Sophia Bahena, who's conducting a comparative case study to examine 3 Texas-based advocacy organizations that are focused on educational equity to co-produce and use research evidence. Bahena will investigate strategies employed by intermediary organizations to understand how and if research is used and or co-produced to successfully inform policymakers' decision. Bahena hypothesizes that evidence paired with community-produced research that is contextualized in the member's district or state, and it incorporates constituent voice, would be most successful at informing policy. So with that, I know that's a lot of information to take in. I would like to pause for Q&A. I don't have access to the text, so I'm inviting Dr. Kim DuMont to join me for this part. And please bring your questions.
Thanks, Anu. Great job of introducing us to what we're looking for in studies on the use of research evidence. We have questions both that were submitted prior to the webinar and today that I'd like to send your way. So Great. The first one was submitted prior to the webinar, and people are wondering about different potential projects. And I have 3 that I'm going to share that have come up either now or prior to the day. The first is, would the following type of research question be acceptable or well suited for this grant program? How can we better bridge the gap between research and practice in restorative practices?
That's a great question. Again, I don't have the entire scope, right? It's just a tagline that we have. If this is in the interest of improving use of research evidence in promoting, let's say, restorative practices, and eventually has the potential to improve youth outcomes, then definitely it will be under our eligibility and fit criteria, it would qualify. So I would encourage them to develop the element of studying, improving the use of research evidence to that end, and have a youth focus.
Great, thank you for that. A second one is just a point of clarification, so I'd like to get that out of the way before I introduce some of the other ideas that people are sharing.
Sure.
They noticed that, viewers noticed that the examples you had only listed one principal investigator or one investigator on the grant. Is that typical, or did you represent everyone when you were presenting that?
Oh, that's a great question. I know the names that I've listed is just the PI, and that's why for some of these I said the name of the PI and team. So let me just say, we do, the grants are usually made to a tax-exempt institution, right? We're funding an institution. But as a matter of the team composition, for, let's say it's an officer's research grant, it's smaller in scope, it could just be the PI, even for a major research grant. But mostly when you see if there are larger projects that require a lot of moving parts, they do have larger teams. So there's, you know, a PI, a co-PI, some people bring on consultants, advisors, and so depending on the needs of the group. So it could be an individual or a team. I hope that clarifies that.
Sure, and just to be more specific to the examples you gave, I think in one of the major grants with Bruce Torpeda, he also has a constant partner with Kimberly Becker. On the Richard Walsh team, part of their partners are members of the school district with whom they're working.
That's
in the
right.
Officers Research Award with Megan Hopkins, because they're concerned about a legal issue, they're also working with lawyers as well as other researchers on the team. So it can get defined in many ways. So that's a great question. Circling back to an idea someone had about a possible question and wondering whether it would be of interest. Does your organization fund exploratory research focused on developing models? One of the challenges we've identified in our work with community-based organizations is the lack of a model for community-based organizations to access research findings, which are often locked behind paywalls. We're looking to refine and expand a different model to address this barrier and better support the use of research evidence and partnerships. Would that fit with the Foundation's interests? To begin developing the model to create greater access for greater use?
Wow. First of all, thank you for the question and for sharing the details around your thinking. I'm just going to preface this answer by saying we make decisions when we look at an LOI, but from what I'm hearing, it sounds like even the formative and the exploratory work is building to create, as you said, a model, a framework, a tool to improve the use of research evidence. So if it's well articulated, it's motivated by literature, then yes, it does align with our priorities. And I will say that the two examples, if you remember from the first line of inquiry that I shared from Dr. Yoakum and Dr. Felix, one is developing a budgeting toolkit, and the other is multi-criteria decision-making tool. Now, both of them are undertaking some pilot work, some, formative work to then finalize what they have and then test it. So short answer is yes, because it's building towards a strategy to improve the use of research evidence.
Great. We also have a lot of questions that I'm holding, just so people know, until we get to the eligibility conversation in the next part. Some are about the eligibility of the investigators or organization. Some questions are about the eligibility of the research questions and the populations included, so I'm holding off, but we will try to get to those. One question that we have was whether you could give an example, and I think you had it even in the studies you shared, of a research project that addressed conceptual use, the influence of research evidence on decision makers' understanding of problems and potential solutions. In my mind, I'm thinking of the Richard Welsh, but if you have another example you want to share, that would be great.
Yes, that's a great question. I think the last slide that I just shared, Megan Hopkins, they are also getting at the conceptual use among the legal advocates as they engage in the co-production process. So when they're co-designing research agenda and engaging with researchers, they anticipate, or at least they're hypothesizing, shifts in the conceptual use of research evidence.
So I imagine you want to move on to the next phase, and then we can get to these many questions about the eligibility.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you all for submitting the questions. I appreciate that. All right, so now we'll move on to the second part, which is the application process. And I know we got a lot of questions about this. I'm just going to start off by saying that most of these answers you'll get in our application guidelines that have been released and available on our website for 2025. But I'll give you a snapshot of the key things that you need to know. The point of entry for major grants and officers' research grants is a letter of inquiry, and that is a 5-page narrative. Just think of it as a mini proposal, right? That defines the study's key research questions, the hypotheses, that describes relevant literature, your motivating theory, why are you undertaking, why is this important, and then offers a concise overview of the sampling strategy, methods, measures, and analysis plan. And I as I'm saying it, I do hear it. It's 5 pages, but as long as you can have a very tight narrative that shows your motivation and your thinking of the more specificity that you can have, the better a letter of inquiry has a chance to compete. So let's look at the differences between the major grants and the officers' research grants. So I'm going to go over the major grants first. The funding limits for the major grants is for the use of research evidence portfolio from $100,000 to $1 million over a period of 2 to 4 years. And this includes up to 15% in indirect costs. Now, these are studies that could involve secondary data analysis. They would be funded at a lower range, going up to $300,000. Whereas studies that are involving new data collection, they qualify for larger budgets, which land somewhere between $300,000 to $600,000. And generally only proposals that launch experiments in which settings are randomly assigned to conditions, they are eligible for funding above $600,000, going up to $1 million. And when we talk about randomizing utility institutions, it could be schools, child welfare agencies, justice settings, you name it. So when you submit an LOI, the letter of inquiry for a major grant, you're not required to submit budget materials. We just need to know your ask, because there is a second step to that review process. After the letter of inquiry, the applications that are competitive are invited to submit a full proposal. So that's the time to bring in the budget, but not at the LOI stage. It is just the 5-page narrative. And I'll just reinforce that we have 3 deadlines a year, and the next deadline is January 8th. It's coming up quick. And then we accept them in May and August. And these deadlines are also available on our application guidelines. And then the officers' research grants, as you'll see, like I said, they're narrower in scope. I would say if you're beginning to develop this line of inquiry and line of thinking, if you're new to the area, or if you are building off of a larger project or doing a smaller study, the funding is between $25,000 to $50,000 over 1 to 2 years, and that includes up to 15% in indirect costs. And these, like I said, could be standalone or, you know, building off of larger projects. So the budget just needs to be appropriate for the activities that are proposed. And because the officer's research grants are funded based on the 5-page narrative and the letter of inquiry, we require budget material. So we'd like to see how you're breaking down the budget and if it aligns with the research design and the research activities that you're proposing. So we only accept applications for officers grants twice a year. So the next deadline is January 8th, and the next deadline would be August 6th. So what you'll see is in the May cycle, we only accept LOIs for major research grants. So here's an overview of our review process. So I'll try to just limit it, most of the details to the LOI review process, and try to be brief for the subsequent ones, just so you have a snapshot of the journey of a successful proposal. Letters of inquiry, like I said, for major grants are accepted 3 times a year. Next deadline is in January. All these submissions are done electronically. They are processed through our grant application system, Smart Simple, and they are reviewed internally for eligibility first, fit, and quality. So after you've gone through it, as you'll see, you submit your LOI. There are 2 internal staff reviews. We all get together as a team, we deliberate, and either it's declined or it's invited to submit a full proposal. In some cases, we do offer or encourage a resubmission and offer customized feedback. And, and for those who are invited, if there is a need, the foundation has also been providing methodological consultations. So the next step, if you are successful in the cycle, you're invited to submit a full proposal. And full proposals are more developed versions of the LOI, and they're also accepted 3 times a year, and they undergo a rigorous review process. And we invite about 15% of the applicants to submit a full proposal. When they're received for the use of research evidence portfolio, they're sent out for external review to at least 3 reviewers. The reason I say at least 3 is because we have now also introduced an early career reviewer program to bring in early career scholars who are interested in developing a research portfolio and improving the use of research evidence. So participants in that program, scholars in the ECR program, early career reviewer program, also end up serving as the 4th external reviewer on these full proposal reviews. So the standard is that we would recruit 2 reviewers for their content and methodological expertise, and the 3rd reviewer actually sits in the policy or practice space that is relevant to the area of research. So the good thing about that review process is whether you're successful and moving ahead, you are getting a revise, a resubmit, or a decline, you are getting feedback from really, brilliant minds, and it's very, very helpful in developing your research. So these reviews that come in, they'll help in the internal decision making on what moves forward. They are again reviewed by 2 members of our senior program team that consists of our president, vice president of program, senior vice president of program, 2 senior research advisors, and our 3 program officers. That also includes one of them is a senior program officer. And following this review, few investigators will be offered an opportunity to provide a written response to the concerns raised by the reviewers, whether it's internal or external. When I say internal, it's the senior program staff, and external reviewers, anywhere from 3 to 4 for URE. When they review the response that comes in, then we make a recommendation for funding. They're presented to a board of trustees for final approval. So about 1/4 to 1/3 move to the board for approval, and ultimately I'd say about 5% of the LOIs are funded, and about 8% of the ORs. When I say ORs, that is officers' research grants. I'd say for the full proposal, the turnaround is about 10 to 15 months from the LOI to funding approval by the board. So that is the turnaround. For officers' research grants, because they're reviewed and decided on internally, the turnaround is up to 10 weeks at most. And once you become a grantee, then you just submit an annual program report of the progress of the project, and they are reviewed by your assigned post-award reviewer. And we also have grantee meetings to come together and really, just develop our research and go through that. But I can answer more questions about the review process if you have any, but I'm going to get to the more interesting part of it, which is the fit criteria for URE grants. So what makes your research a good fit? Like I said, once the LOIs come in, first we screen them for eligibility. Who are eligible applicants? They're employed at tax-exempt organizations who are seeking funds primarily to support research activities. We do not fund other parts of, let's say, conducting an intervention or operational costs. So most of the funds have to go towards conducting research. And our research grants are, the projects have to be relevant to youth between the ages of 5 to 25 within the US. Second important consideration concerns a construct that is central to every research project in this focus area, which is the use of research evidence. So we want you to think very critically about how your research team will conceptualize and measure the use of research evidence. So the first step is to define what is research evidence that is relevant to your study. So we define it as empirical evidence that is derived from systematic methods and analysis. And I will also say there is a blog on this on our website. Please be very mindful that we do not equate data with research evidence. So studies that focus squarely on data use and not research evidence use do not make the cut. The second step is to convey how you're conceptualizing the use of research evidence. So like I've mentioned some of these terms before, is it a direct application to decision-making, which is instrumental use of evidence, conceptual influences on how decision-makers think about problems, strategic uses to justify existing stances. So whatever form of research evidence use you're interested in, that needs to be situated within the larger theoretical framework and context, right? So we want you to offer an operational definition of research use and stating how that will be assessed using the measures and analysis plan. It should be easy for the reviewers to discern the type or types of research use you're studying and how you will get to measuring and analyzing use. So if you're conceptualizing research as being instrumental and expected to be evident in the course of a specific decision, such as what program to adopt, which caseloads to prioritize, or how to instruct, reviewers will want to know how and what information you're going to look at, listen to, or ask about to be convinced that an instrumental use of research has occurred. I will just underline once again that decision makers here that we're interested in are not limited to individuals or agencies with formal policymaking or policy implementation authority. So not just school leaders, school district leaders, state child welfare agency managers, county legislators, advocates who influence policymaking, policy implementation, or even intermediaries such as professional associations that provide information, they provide consultation, technical assistance to inform their members' decision-making. They all fall under the umbrella, and we welcome studies that are including them. And I just want to reiterate that we're not limited by the type of study design and methodology that we fund. All we like to see is that the study design and the methods that you're using, they fit the research questions. And like we talked about it earlier, the research questions are in the interest of improving the use of research evidence. So we're asked always, do we prefer a particular research design or method? And the answer is no. So there are a range of designs, and I'd say maybe this doesn't even capture the entirety of it, right? So there are descriptive studies that are meant to clarify the mechanisms for improving research use. There were some studies that I've shared that are descriptive in nature. Most of the case study designs would fall under that umbrella. We welcome intervention studies that examine attempts to improve the use of research evidence. So, for instance, the Crowley study that I shared is a very structured intervention, and they're optimizing it and adapting it and taking it forward. So a randomized control trial might test whether an intervention that provides schools with technical assistance and coaching on the use of research evidence is likely to lead to the adoption of a research-based program. So again, I would just say that for both these type of studies, this is an additional consideration, is the need for longitudinal designs that allow for prospective data collection about research use. So you can really see whether a strategy creates a sustained use of evidence through times of transition and staff turnover. Do you have to do it? No. If there is a possibility, we encourage that. And the last is that we welcome measurement studies. We recognize that lines of inquiry may require modification of existing measure and development of new measures. Maybe the existing measures do not capture the type of research use in your particular setting adequately, and you'd like to either adapt a measure or you'd like to develop a new one, and we welcome those studies. So here are the tips for a competitive LOI. The first is we recommend grounding your study in prior theoretical and empirical work. And this can draw on work by foundation's grantees or engage other traditions for studying how to strengthen conditions between research, practice, and policy communities. So, for instance, improvement science can help us think about change management as it relates to introducing and integrating research evidence, and the fields of knowledge translation and mobilization have a history of developing strategies to advance that knowledge. So you can ground it in your own work, foundation's work, or a different discipline. The second is prioritize the research activities and lead with research questions and offer hypotheses if and when possible. So successful letters are prioritizing research activities. We like to see that, also because it is a big part of our eligibility criteria. And we see systematic studies on improving research use. That means that the questions are primary. The change efforts are secondary. So most successful letters will lead with their research objectives, aims, questions, and like I said, if possible, certain hypotheses. We like to see how are you thinking about it. And then we like to focus on decision makers. And like I earlier emphasized, these are folks who do not directly interact with youth. They're administrators, they're community leaders, organizational leaders, intermediary organizations, and staffers at the federal or state level, even like I demonstrated earlier, county, local level. And then successful letters will always demonstrate how the project adds value to theory, directly or indirectly has the potential to inform practice and policy. And like I said, distally, youth outcomes. How can we influence them? We should be able to see that in your theory of change. And I'd say we particularly encourage proposal from diverse teams and, multidisciplinary mixed method studies. They're all welcome. Please do not feel restrained by, oh, I don't do quantitative work, oh, I'm not engaging in causal designs. That's okay. Whatever your discipline is should not restrict what your methodological training is. Also shouldn't be very restrictive. And also remember, we do fund teams. So you can always bring together a group of people who provide complementary expertise. And we welcome resubmissions. So if you're declined, whether at the LOI stage or full proposal stage, will give you a good indication of whether why your proposal was declined and if there's potential to come back and revise and resubmit. So do not be discouraged if you are declined the first time. I'm just going to be very quick in my examples. I'm just going to revisit Richard Welch's study here just to tie into what made this very competitive, um, uh, and tying into the tips that I just discussed, right? Grounded in prior work, prioritizing activities, who are the decision makers and why it adds value. So they're engaging with literature to motivate the need to study equity-centered RPPs. So there is a lot of literature around RPPs. Equity-centered RPPs are just not well studied. So they really motivated the need to do that, and why that was a good strategy to improve research use. So they're looking at what is the role of race and power in partnership dynamics, how they play out in partnership dynamics, and then how do these influence research use by a range of decision makers. And so what this study aims to do, what this adds, is they'll develop a clear theory of action that will advance understanding of equity-focused RPPs and conditions necessary for research use and decision making. There's also, as I was talking about intervention studies, an adaptation that we've recently funded of the research to policy collaboration model that is improving the use of prevention science research at the state level. How this is informed by previous researches, because we have demonstrated success at the federal level, but there was no evidence at the state level. They've evaluated the this is to evaluate the effectiveness of the RPC model on state policymakers' engagement, value, and awareness of substance misuse research. And this is a nonpartisan relational approach to support state policymakers. So who are the decision makers? It's the state policymakers. And these will yield evidence on state level knowledge mobilization infrastructure and how that impacts research use, and also how it addresses substance use. So they're not measuring the substance use among youth, but we can see the theory of change, how that has the potential to impact youth outcomes. So I think that was a lot of information. I hope that we have some time to answer all your questions. Kim, I'd like to invite you back.
Sure, thanks Anu, and that was a lot of information and the questions are rolling in. I'm going to ask you to think about one question and I'll give you a little breather and take some of the others for myself. But one question for you to think about is, what expectation does the foundation have for what happens to the research about research use? Okay, so we see here we have a number of questions. We have several people have asked about the eligibility of the sample. Do they need to focus only on children in the 5 to 25-year age range? Can they include younger children? Our response to that is the foundation focuses on the 5 to 25 age range. So the research question should really fit with that age group, and the majority of the sample that you're studying, and therefore the funds you're requesting, should also fall within that age range. So that's one set of questions that people are asking about. The questions that many people have asked, would this fit? Is this a good idea? I'm going to suggest that we follow up with quick emails after the call so we can provide more nuanced responses to that.
Sure.
Another question is, if people have partners, say for example schools that they want to work with, do those need to be identified prior to the submission of the letter of inquiry? And again, I'll take this anew, so I'm giving you a little break.
Thank you.
Is that while we don't require that you have identified the schools or another partner prior to, it often benefits the construction of the letter of inquiry. Your partners often have ideas to help refine the researcher question or seed the research questions. Knowing that they're going to participate can help you as a researcher design the study in a way that's more feasible. So you don't have to have a letter of agreement or support at the letter of inquiry stage, but we do see advantages of identifying and including some of those partners who will be participating in the study at the outset. All right, Anu, I'm going to come back to you about the expectations that we have for what happens to the research about research use.
Okay. Before I answer that, I just want to add to what you said. I totally agree that having a partnership in place is valuable, though not necessary. But if you're invited to submit a full proposal, I think having partners on board, having a few letters of support assuage any feasibility concerns among the reviewers. Again, is it necessary? No, but in addition to what Kim said, how it can be such a benefit to improving the research submission, the proposal submission, it also really provides more confidence that the team is well positioned to carry out the work successfully and is not going to run into any barriers, so to speak. Okay, so if I remember the question correctly, Kim, what are the expectations, our expectations of what happens to the research that is produced on research use, right? The research that we're funding, the research that we're funding. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. So why do we do research, right? I'm a socio-behavioral scientist. I've done research in the past that was responsive to the needs of FDA's policymaking on combustible tobacco. Now, the goal is to actually, the ultimate goal is to improve youth outcomes, to really also make the work that you do as researchers and scholars not just disappear in the ether. It's published, it's sitting somewhere and waiting to be used, but really gets used up. And what we generate from this study can be really valuable, not just to researchers, but to policymakers to say, hey, we're grappling with this problem. Here's some evidence on how we can create routines and processes, and they'll help us make better decisions for the goals that we need to accomplish for youth in our case. But broadly in the field, of course, people are tackling many, many different issues across disciplines. Would you like to add anything to that, Kim?
Sure. I would say very concretely that we hope that our grantees deposit their measures in the URE methods repository that's been established and share their work both with communities or decision makers of some sort, as well as in the peer-reviewed literature. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because we have a lot of questions. I'm going to give you another question to think about, Anu, while I take some of the others. What's the main way that applicants misunderstand or misinterpret studies on improving use of research evidence? And I'm going to let you close with that one. So I'm going to take a few others in the meantime. So one set of questions is about the kind of outcomes that we prioritize. And we're very open here in the improving use of research evidence area. It needs to affect and relate to young people. And we are open across the scope to behavioral outcomes, educational outcomes, economic outcomes, social, emotional outcomes. You can do health outcomes. So please submit your ideas to us. Another question that we have concerns picking up on some of the research that was presented in terms of the kinds of causal analyses that, or questions that we're inviting, whether we limit those studies to be randomized controlled trials. No, we really welcome studies that have used quasi-experimental designs to get at causal questions. I think the best examples for us fall within our reducing inequality portfolio, particularly around the policy studies, but they're welcome in this space as well. We have 4 minutes left, Anu, so I'm going to come back for you to talk about how frequently or how people misinterpret the question that we've seated here and the invitation for proposals. Again, we'll make the slides available and the recording available. We'll follow up with the emails people who are saying, would this be of interest? And Anu, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Kim. And also whoever submitted that question, I really want to thank you. And I will be very careful in answering the question. The one thing that I've seen time and again, the misinterpretation of use of research evidence, and that's why I kept saying studying, strategies to improve the use of research evidence. Because use of research evidence in and itself can just convey there is an evidence-based strategy, there's a research-based strategy, and you need to use it. And that, sort of falls under implementation science. And a lot of proposals that are just doing that, they're just using an intervention or a strategy devoid of a focus on improving the use of research evidence. Those are, I see them as very common misinterpretation of using research evidence. So I know we do a shorthand of URE, but I just want to say the phrase is really studying improving use of research evidence. So this is not to say that interventions are off the mark. No, we've talked about the Crowley studies where now it's an evidence-based strategy, the research to policy collaboration model, but that intervention is really designed to increase the take-up of existing research or to even co-produce research among researchers and policymakers, whether they're at the federal level or if they're at the state level. So, so I think that would be the number one for me. I don't know, Kim, have you caught any other slippery slopes?
Nope. I think that's good. I'll let you end us here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. As I'm ending, I just want to do a quick reminder, especially for the early career reviewers, early career scholars, or folks who are mentoring early career researchers within 7 years of terminal degree. If you're interested in learning more, if you've worked a bit, but you want to develop this line of research, you have an opportunity to apply to this program, the Early Career Reviewer Program, and serve as peer reviewers for full proposals in URE, where you'll receive personalized feedback from program officer, in this case it would be me, on your submitted review, and then you have a chance to resubmit, and then you get access to peer reviewers from other scholars who have reviewed the same proposal. And this is done in the interest of to develop understanding of our grant writing, grant reviewing process. So I encourage you to keep an eye out. If you're a part of this webinar, you potentially will get a reminder when the applications open in May and they close in July. And this is a very short application. It's literally, a short CV and 1 to 2 page cover letter. So with that, I would just say thank you for your time, and please use our website, please use the resources, and we look forward to your letter of inquiry. Have a lovely week ahead.